So in this webinar, I'm going to give you a step-by-step guide to starting a threat management program, which is going to help you identify when someone's behaviors could be leading them on that pathway to violence. And it gives us the opportunity to interject, to disrupt them or lead them closer to the Lord, to help them sort of remove themselves from that potentially harmful situation. So I'm going to give you a step-by-step guide as to what to do. Now, as Lee mentioned, some of you might not have come across me before. I've done a few webinars with Smart Church Solutions, honored and privileged to be one of their security partners. But I'm also a best-selling author. I have a book on conflict de-escalation, an Amazon bestseller, and my most well-known book is Securing Church Operations. I have a 7-step plan for church ministry and safety leaders. Now, part of my journey before the Lord called me into what I call security ministry, I served as a police officer in England for just under 14 years as a detective investigating organised crime and terrorism. And one of my most notable cases is working with MI5 during the liquid bomb terrorism plot in 2006, which changed aviation security worldwide, limiting the amount of liquids that were taken on planes to this day. Now, when I first emigrated here to the US, and actually I became an American citizen last year, so I guess technically I'm a British American now. When I first emigrated here, I was head of counterterrorism at Mall of America. And it was really here that the Lord combined my skills and background in law enforcement and physical security with helping his churches. Actually, I was talking at a sports conference in Disney, and the local police department called me and said, "Simon, we know you're a Christian. You've got this background in safety and security. Can you help this mega church around sort of building their security program?" And I went there one Wednesday evening, wasn't too sure what I was walking into. But I knew two things as a result of that the Lord was really calling me to use my skills and abilities to help keep his churches safe. And second, I knew that I'd found one of my true purposes was to help to keep his churches safe. And that was in 2013. We're coming up to a decade. And since then, I've now helped thousands of churches across the country stay safe and secure. And now the sort of mission's gone wider than that, now into nonprofits. When I left Mall of America, I went into financial risk compliance, where I've been a director overseeing risk management, business continuity, crisis management programs, anti-bribery programs, third-party vendor assurance, which is how do you manage the risk around your vendors. So there's a wide variety of things that I've done in my background. And it really led me in 2014. I created Kingswood Security Consulting, which, as Lee started to mention, primarily focuses on emergency preparedness, security risk assessment, and helping organizations create their emergency plans so we know that they can stay safe. In the middle there, you'll see the book by The Violence Project, written by a good friend of mine, and another Brit living here in America called Dr. James Densley. Their organisation, The Violence Project, this book is well worth picking up, and actually some of my teachings feature in this book. They've researched every mass shooting in America from 1966 to the current day, and there's 4 commonalities that all these mass shooters have in common. And it talks a lot about crisis intervention. And for us as Christ followers, it gives us really a roadmap as to how we can do the biblical work to, again, lead these people from that dark place that they are in. So we're going to talk now about threat assessment and how do we identify, recognize, and respond to threats in our house of worship. And perhaps, depending where you are at your church, perhaps this is a bit like you, that you might be hitting the bullseye every now and again, but you could also be missing when you're trying to evaluate your threats. And what I hope to give you by the end of this webinar is more of a system and a structure that you can follow, which will allow you to examine, explore, and assess threats in a very specific way, so you're hitting the bullseye more often and you're reaching a determination as to what it is that you need to do. So I want to start off talking a little bit about, well, what is threat assessment and management? And really, threat assessment is a fact-based method and investigation to determine if a person is moving towards an act of violence. So this is a fact-based method. And we hear it quite a lot about, well, workplace violence. But what's the difference between threat assessment then and workplace violence? And really, the difference is that these behaviours now concern the safety from violence with a nexus between their behaviour and the workplace. So very similar definitions. I want to take you through some key concepts. So what we're talking about within threat assessment is that we're going to ask ourselves, does the situation pose a threat? Not did the person make a threat? Remember, behavior threat assessment is a fact-based investigative tool that we're going to use to assess threats, to work out, is someone leading down a pathway to violence, which might lead to one of these deadly force attacks that we hear. So no longer we're going to say, did the person make a threat? Does the situation pose a threat? And again, this reaffirms what I said earlier, that nobody just snaps. There's always a trigger. There's always an understandable series of sequential events. And we're seeing this again in the tragedy that just occurred in Nashville, where we're hearing about the person had some sort of mental and emotional struggles that they are undergoing right now. We know there was some struggles on their sort of sexuality and sort of transgender, identifying as a man and a woman. We know there's a lot of confusion in this person's life. There's always this sequential series of events that lead people to an act of violence. And again, most often these behaviors are observable. Now, we don't always see all of the pie, but sometimes we see a slice of the pie, which is enough to enable us to make an informed decision. So I don't want you to feel that, well, we don't know everything. We never do. We find out that information post. We hear about the manifesto. We hear about the social media posting. We hear about the mental illness. We hear about the purchase of firearms. We hear about the threats of violence. What we have to try and do is piece together what it is that we know, but there's often a noticeable crisis, and these are observable behaviors. So when we look at key concepts, well, what are some of those things that lead someone to the pathway to violence? And you see on the left-hand side here, we have stressors. So stressors are those things in our lives which could cause a person to start moving towards that point of violence. Mental health, financial strain, the loss of a job, marital problems, conflict, drug abuse, chemical abuse, death of a loved one. There's actually a shooting recently where the father of the assailant said that his son started to change when his mother passed away, and the father puts that down as part of the reason why he carried out a deadly force attack, where he had some mental health troubles once his mother had deceased. So we have these stressors in our lives. But most often we have things that prevent us from carrying out an act of violence or leading on that pathway. And we call those inhibitors. And these are the things that stand in the way. So these are a supportive family for someone who's got mental illness. This could be social support for someone who's having a sort of a troubled time. This could be that someone is on the radar as having mental illness, they're making threats towards other people, and they're being monitored by law enforcement, they're being treated by nurses, and their family are well aware of the type of comments that they're making, that they want to kill themselves, they want to kill other people. So there's these inhibitors which prevent someone getting on that pathway to violence.